Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video, and I thought that it would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a conversation over one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world, if not at the current moment in time, the number one pound for pound fighter in the world, now that Canelo Alvarez has lost his last fight. And of course, that fighter that of course I am talking about is Mr. Terence Bud Crawford. And Terence Bud Crawford apparently recently came out with his current top five pound for pound list. And that's not me saying that I agreed overall with every single spot that he had, but I thought that it was a very, very interesting list. I do agree with at least three of the five fighters that he had within that top five pound for pound list, and I'm not going to reveal straight away who he all had on there. But we are going to go through it within this video, and of course, Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to talk about it as well. And Dante's Boxing Nation, of course, with Terence Bud Crawford's list, he did not necessarily like his list because Terence Crawford overall, he had certain people that Dante would not want to be on the list. But anyways, overall, we're going to see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation and Terence Bud Crawford had to say. I thought that this would be an interesting topic to talk about. Let's get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So, in the last year, there's been a lot of changes on the pound for pound list. Jamel Charlo has just become the undisputed champion in arguably the deepest division in boxing. And Devin Haney just became.
Once again, let me state this. No, Jamel Charlo did not become undisputed in one of the deepest divisions in boxing. Uh, and listen, most divisions in the fight game are not going to be extraordinarily deep, or at least as deep as some of the most talented divisions. 154 is nowhere near as talented as 147 is. It's nowhere near as talented as what 135 is. It's not as talented as what heavyweight is, excuse me, at the current moment in time, in my view. It's not as talented overall as some of the other divisions that I also see out there. 154, in my view, and this is my view of the situation, it probably is one of the top five weakest divisions in all of boxing right now. Or, well, debatably, maybe it's within that top seven, somewhere around there. But, and I know a certain amount of people, they're not going to like that because they're going to take a look at that division. They're going to say, what are you talking about? You have Jamel Charlo there, Brian Gastano. You have, what the hell is the new kid's name? Sebastian Fundora, Erickson Lube, Tony Harrison. That's understandable, but a lot of those guys, to be quite honest with you, they're really not A grade fighters. I mean, really, besides Jamel Charlo and Brian Gastano, I'm sorry, but this is just my opinion of the situation. I do not think that that division is really that deep at all. Tony Harrison is really not that good of a fighter. He has proven that pretty much in every single championship fight, besides that first Jamel Charlo fight, possibly where Jamel Charlo, underestimated him a little bit, or maybe it was just because he was a tough matchup for him. Maybe a little bit of both. Who knows? But really, besides that fight, Tony Harrison has never proved to be an A grade fighter. To be honest with you, he's never really even proved to be a B grade fighter. Julian J. Rock Williams, he had his little bit of time, but he pretty much dipped off. He has been a B grade fighter, really even a C grade fighter, especially after that loss to Jason Rosario. Jason Rosario has never been an A grade fighter. I don't care what anybody says. He is not an elite fighter, never has been. When we talk about Erickson Lubin is another fighter that is never going to be an A grade fighter. He's a very talented athlete, but he is never going to be an A grade fighter. Okay? It is what it is. Brian Gastano was an A grade fighter. So I do give Jamel Charlo a lot of credit for that. But when people say that that is one of the deepest divisions in boxing, I can't help but laugh because no, I'm sorry. That is not one of the deepest divisions in boxing. That actually is one of the weaker. Now, it's not the weakest in my opinion. But in my view, it is a little bit that of the weaker divisions in boxing. It just is what it is. It's not necessarily as weak as, say, maybe overall what the cruiserweight division would be right now, maybe, or maybe overall as weak as, say, maybe another division that I'm not thinking of at the current moment in time. But that is one of the weaker divisions. I'm sorry, there's just no real threats there other than Brian Gastano and Jamel Charlo. There just isn't.
Disputed in one of the most deepest divisions in the sport as well. So pound for pound, the best fighter in the world, Terence Crawford, he came out and he gave his top five when it comes to pound for pound. And he has himself at number one, Inoue at number two, Usyk at number three, Errol Spence, and then Devin Haney at number five. Now,
And let me say this: whatever your pound for pound list is, that is your opinion. One thing I'll give Terence Bud Crawford for is this: is that he put his actual opinion out there, and that he was not afraid to put it out there. Because a lot of people you can tell all in all with their pound for pound list, they either let their fans overall kind of twist their opinions or twist their mind overall about certain things, or all in all you can tell that they have a very racially motivated list of racial opinions. But what you can tell about this is that Terence Crawford, overall, these are the fighters that he respects or that he truly believes that are on the top five pound for pound list. And I agree with 3 out of the 5 fighters being within his top 5 pound for pound list. I would have Terence Crawford up within my top 5, definitely. I would have Errol Spence up there, and I also would have Oleksandr Usyk. Naoya Inoue, even though a lot of people want to argue that he is a top 5 pound for pound fighter, listen, I give the kid credit. I think that he is an extremely talented athlete, and I think that he's also extraordinarily talented. But I cannot really see him within the top 5 pound for pound until I start to see names like a Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez or Juan Francisco Estrada or Stephen Fulton or someone else of those names, fighters that I believe are truly A grade. I cannot really see him within my top 5 pound for pound. You cannot be the top 5 pound for pound in my opinion with no A grade names on your list. And Terence Crawford for a very long time was actually somewhat within my top 5 pound for pound overall with no A grade names, but he especially overall secured himself there when he got that one over Sean Porter. And maybe you could debate that when he ended up getting those wins over Gamboa and Victor Poso, that maybe those were A- wins. But I don't really even know if Naoya Inoue has a debatable A- win. I mean, maybe you would debate the Nonito Donaire win. Maybe if you were desperate, maybe you could debate that that's an A- win. But Nonito Donaire really has not been the same fighter ever since he really lost to Guillermo Rigondeaux several years ago in dominant fashion. So it just is what it is. Another fighter that, even though I now do have him on my top 10 pound for pound list, and I have all these fighters that I see on this list on my top 10 pound for pound, so I really overall don't think that it's a bad thing overall necessarily. It's his opinion. But Devin Haney, in my view, would not be as high as number 5 because I just don't think that he's done enough yet. And a certain amount of people may say, well, what the hell are you talking about? He just recently unified 135, a very talented division. Yes, but he didn't face a lot of the talented guys there. He faced George Kambosos, which I give him a lot of credit for. But George Kambosos, to be quite honest with you, let's be real, he pretty much was another James Buster Douglas or Andy Ruiz or Jermaine Taylor, someone who ended up winning the belts with, but was not going to have them for long. So it just is what it is. But don't get it twisted. Devin Haney is extraordinarily talented. And after what he has accomplished, especially in a short amount of time, and what he has been willing to prove, he does have to be now within my top 10 pound for pound. But anyway.
just so many things about Terence Crawford's top five that doesn't really make sense. Terence Crawford will be fighting.
Well, that doesn't really make sense to you. And let's be real, Dante, if I had to guess, a certain amount of the problems that you have with this list is that it's not just 5 black fighters. So it just is what it is. Because that's pretty much all Dante's and New Media's list is going to be. What 10 American black fighters can we really put on this list? And that's overall, ESPN basically has the opposite job. What non-black fighters can we basically put on our pound for pound list? Or boxing scene when it comes down to it. And that's not me saying that they all do that every single time. But that's why overall I don't usually trust most people's opinions when it comes to sports debates. And I don't really trust overall, most pound for pound lists. And Dante's Boxing Nation is no offense against him, but his pound for pound list really ain't no better. So it is what it is. But anyway.
Against Errol Spence for undisputed in his very next fight. So why wouldn't Terence Crawford have Errol Spence at number 2? I mean, wouldn't you think that Terence Crawford would want all the credit in the world if he were able to beat Errol Spence for undisputed? And it wouldn't be like,
well, maybe Terence Bud Crawford is more secure in his abilities and more secure overall in his history than that. Now, if you were to debate Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. as number 1 and number 2, I really wouldn't have a huge problem with that. But, it would be a little bit debatable. Right now, I think it's really debatable who the number 1 pound for pound fighter is. Before, when Canelo Alvarez had not lost in several years, I thought that it purely was him because of the competition and because of the dominance and the skill set that he was showing. But Right now, in my view, once again, it's between four fighters. You have Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence in that mix, and I believe you also have Tyson Fury and Oleksandr Usyk. Tyson Fury, who just said today, by the way, that he is apparently officially unretired. I don't think that he ever really was 100% ever retired in the first place. And Dante knew that, but he doesn't want someone like a Tyson Fury on the pound for pound list for obvious reasons. It just is what it is. But anyway, when it comes down to it, all in all, I believe that Terence Bud Crawford, that him having Errol Spence Jr. in number 4, I mean, it's not like overall he didn't have him on the top 10 pound for pound list whatsoever. Basically, that what Terence Crawford is saying is that he believes that Errol Spence is a great fighter, but he overall does not believe that he's on his level. And I really don't have a problem with that. That's Terence Crawford's view. Basically, what that tells me is that he's confident in his abilities. And I believe that Terence Bud Crawford believes that he will beat Errol Spence Jr. And that is a fight that could go either way. So that is an amazing fight. I do hope that that fight happens this year. And if that fight does end up happening this year, the winner of that fight will more than likely at least somewhat be the undisputed number 1 pound for pound fighter in the world. And some of you may say, well, why would you say somewhat undisputed before you said that Canelo Alvarez was the undisputed champion of the world, or at least number 1 pound for pound fighter? Well, that was because Canelo Alvarez, with the things that he had done, and also with the divisions that he had done him in, he was a 4-weight division champion with his size. And on top of that, if Errol Spence Jr. ends up being, let's say on the note that he ends up defeating Terence Bud Crawford, he will, in my view, be then more than likely my number 1 pick for the number 1 pound for pound fighter. But because only his work within 1-weight division, I also would like to see him face that of Jermell Charlo maybe next, but we'll see what happens. If Terence Crawford ends up winning it, I think that he'll have a better argument for the undisputed number 1 pound for pound fighter, because he's already done work in 2 other weight divisions, even though maybe some may debate that it wasn't always against great fighters, but, what's done is done.
Crawford is putting someone there that doesn't deserve to be there. There is no way Inoue has a resume that can match Errol Spence's resume. And Crawford already made it very...
I would agree with you. But you should have been saying the same thing about Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford, or Vasily Lomachenko and Terence Bud Crawford. Because Terence Bud Crawford, to be quite honest with you, he does not have the resume of a Canelo Alvarez or Vasily Lomachenko. And basically what your argument was is that, well, the reason why Terence Crawford is above them is because overall he's the most dominant fighter in the world. And, he's still trying to argue that Terence Crawford has a better resume than both of those fighters, which he doesn't in terms of great names. Now, that's not me saying that Terence Bud Crawford is below them on my pound for pound list at the moment in time. I can't do that because, first of all, Vasily Lomachenko, he has no belts and he lost his last big fight, so I can't have him within my top 5 pound for pound. Canelo is at my number 5 spot because he still has those belts at 168, but he did lose his last fight and in somewhat dominant fashion. So I do have to be logical and objective here when it comes down to it. Even though I admire Canelo Alvarez in terms of his skill set, but just like a certain amount of other fighters out there, I admire Terence Crawford and a certain amount of the other fighters that are on the pound for pound list as well. But at the current moment in time, you can argue that Terence Crawford is number 1 pound for pound. The problem with Terence, in my view, is just that he's never really been the undisputed number 1 pound for pound. Terence Crawford has never really been, in my view, the undisputed 100% best boxer in the world, or at least the number 1 pound for pound fighter in terms of all the categories. But if he ends up defeating Errol Spence Jr., that will be the first time in his career, in my view, where he will be the undoubted number 1 pound for pound fighter, no doubt about it. But we'll see what happens.
Clear that he wants to move up. If he were to beat Errol Spence, he wants to move up in weight and fight the undisputed super welterweight champion, Jermell Charlo. But Crawford doesn't even have him in his top.
Let me also state this. Jermell Charlo, in my view, he is not going to beat the winner of the Errol Spence Jr. Terence Bud Crawford fight. He is not going to beat either of them. He does not have the boxing skills as those fighters do. Not even that close. In my view, it's really not even in the same category. I think that Jermell Charlo, if he were a little bit smaller and naturally a 147-pounder, I don't even know if he would beat Danny Garcia and Sean Porter, to be quite honest with you. And some people all know they would, heavily disagree with that. Because they would say, oh, well, Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, what are you talking about? They have a lot of flaws. Yeah, so does Jermell Charlo. That's why the only time, or, the time that he lost a fight, that being to Tony Harrison, it was against a C-grade fighter, a fighter that has no chin to speak of whatsoever, and a fighter, all in all, that lost every championship fight that he was a part of before he fought Jermell Charlo. Okay, before he fought Jermell Charlo. So Jamel Charlo, don't get it twisted. I think that he is a good fighter. I think that he's a borderline great fighter, but I don't think that he's going. I don't think that he's anywhere near on the level of Terence Crawford or that of Errol Spence Jr. I don't think that he even has the resume of a Terence Bud Crawford. I don't even know if I would say that Jamel Charlo has a win in his career like that of a Sean Porter. Maybe a Brian Castano if you want to go that far, but that's up to you. I would say that they're about on the same level.
Five. But he has the guy that old media has been trying to replace him with, Inoue at number 2, which in a way is justified.
And you notice that Dante's Boxing Nation that he's saying that they're trying to replace Inoue or Naoya Inoue, however you pronounce his name, Inoue. I don't know if it's Inoue or Inoue, but when it comes down to it, you notice that he's saying that they're trying to replace you with, and I do agree with him to a degree. But notice that Dante that he's been overall trying to push this narrative for a very long time. That's the reason why Canelo was number 1 pound for pound and Vasily Lomachenko, and now they are going to go after Naoya Inoue and Oleksandr Usyk because those are going to be the main guys now that are going to be pushed as the number 1 pound for pound. So you're going to see a lot more videos out about those fighters. And don't get it wrong, I don't think that Naoya Inoue is the number 1 pound for pound fighter either. I will agree 100% with Dante's Boxing Nation on that. However, what I will say is this: Oleksandr Usyk, in my opinion, he does deserve to be in the conversation. You're talking about a fighter that is undefeated, looks like one of the most skilled fighters on the planet, and you're also talking about a fighter that his resume is pretty much up there, overall, at least with recent fighters that have not lost, like a Crawford, like a Spence, like those other guys. You can debate that his resume is somewhat up there because in terms of top 10 pound for pound wins, I had Anthony Joshua within my top 10, at least my top 20 pound per pound at the least. I had Anthony Joshua within my personal top 10 pound per pound when Oleksandr Usyk defeated him. I believe I had him at like number 8 or 9. Talking about Anthony Joshua, that is. And Oleksandr Usyk was able to absolutely embarrass him. So Oleksandr Usyk does have to be up there. But if you put Terence Crawford, Errol Spence, and Tyson Fury, overall above him, I would not necessarily have a problem with that. But Oleksandr Usyk is within my top 5.
And the extremely biased pound for pound list that have Inoue at number 1. And we all know that this is a simple game of follow the leader. Terence Crawford is just following old media ESPN's lead because I can guarantee you, Terence Crawford couldn't name 5 opponents that Inoue has beat. The only reason Terence Crawford even has him on the list is because he sees his name on old media's list all the time.
Well, who the hell knows? Terence Bud Crawford might truly believe that Naoya Inoue, that he truly is the number 2 pound for pound fighter. He might think overall similar lines. He may say, well, Naoya Inoue is someone going within my direction of unifying divisions or looking as dominant, and he's a 3-weight division champion, and he's undefeated. It just might be Terence Bud Crawford's perspective. But once again, it's just so interesting. And don't get me wrong, I somewhat agree with Dante that I believe that Naoya Inoue is a bit too high, in my view. But it's just interesting how, depending on what opinion it is, which fighters he takes seriously and which ones he don't. All of a sudden, Terence Bud Crawford comes out with a list. 2 of them are not Black American fighters, and all of a sudden Dante says, oh, well, Terence Crawford, he's just playing follow the leader, or he's getting brainwashed by these guys. Well, maybe it's just Terence Bud Crawford's opinion. Just like when Canelo Alvarez was ranked as the number 1 pound per pound fighter. And don't get me wrong, if a lot of people, say something is true, a lot of people, even blindly sometimes, will say that, yes, you're correct without even doing the correct research. But certain fighters, especially if you're in professional boxing, you know what you're watching. You know usually what you're doing. And Terence Bud Crawford, he's been a person that has stated for a very, very long time that he believes himself to be the number 1 pound per pound fighter. I don't have a problem with that. And he just recently came out with his top 5 pound per pound list. Okay? And what you notice about the majority of those fighters is that they have, almost unified a division. Right? Or they have became somewhat undisputed in some sort of way.
Inoue's biggest win and the biggest name that he has faced in his entire career is against a 39-year-old Nonito Donaire, who had 6 losses on his record before he got knocked out by Inoue in their second fight. Going into the rematch, Donaire was the 2nd oldest champion in boxing today, right behind Gennady Golovkin. Now compare that opponent to Jamel Charlo's opponents. Charlo just knocked out.
I don't know why these guys have such a hard on for that of Jamel Charlo. I don't know why these guys, Eleanor, are getting so goddamn, precious over Jamel Charlo. Because Jamel Charlo was really not that elite. If he was that damn elite, he would have beat Tony Harrison in that first fight. And don't get me wrong, he was able to adjust. But even in the rematch against Tony Harrison, he was able to give him a hell of a time. Jamel Charlo, I'm sorry, but he's just not that nice in my opinion. He's a good little fighter, but he's not great in terms of his skill set. Dante can, try to spoon feed you this bullshit about how it was one of the deepest divisions in boxing with who in there? What what undefeated fighters overall are in there? You had Julian J. Rock Williams, who Jamel Charlo never even fought. Of course, that's not 100% his fault. Jason Rosario ended up getting the win, but Jason Rosario is not an elite opponent. Jason Rosario, in his last fight, just ended up getting knocked out by Erickson Lubin, I believe, within about 5 or 6 rounds. And Erickson Lubin, we all seen what Sebastian Fundora did to him. So, I mean, come on. How elite is that division really? Don't get me wrong. If you have Jamel Charlo within your top 10 pound for pound, that's you. Would I personally have him within my top 10 pound for pound? It's debatable. If I did, he'd probably be a number 10. I would have both, all the new entries on my list. I have 3 new entries on my list, besides Jamel Charlo, and that would be Dimitri Bivol, Shakur Stevenson, and Devin Haney. I would have all those fighters above Jamel Charlo on my pound for pound list. Every single one of them. All right, they're more skilled than what he is, and they have bigger wins in their career than what he does. Well, at least for Devin Haney, that's a little bit debatable. You can argue that Brian Castano and George Kambosos, that they're someone on a similar level, or that maybe Brian Castano, that he's a bigger win. But at the end of the day, Devin Haney did not lose to a C-grade fighter when he was at the peak of his career. Okay?
Stanio. Before that, it was Jason Rosario. He also knocked out the hammer Erickson Lubin when he was undefeated. Came back.
Right, but come on. Erickson Lubin is not that great of a fighter. I'm sorry, he just isn't. Has Erickson Lubin really even ever won an official championship? No, he hasn't. He hasn't.
The rematch knocked out the very skilled Tony Harrison. I know he doesn't have
the very skilled Tony Harrison. What the hell is this guy talking about? The very skilled Tony Harrison? This dude lost every big fight in his career overall before he fought Jamel Charlo. Then he went into that first fight and he upset Jamel Charlo. The very skilled Tony Harrison. What the hell are you talking about, dude? Tony Harrison, this is the same idiot. No offense against Dante, but that's just what he is. This is the same guy, all in all, that would always debate with Canelo Alvarez that he would avoid the undefeated black fighters, and the only ones that he fought were the ones that already lost when it came down to it. So then why the hell are we not talking about that Jamel Charlo, that he fought a Tony Harrison that already had 3 knockout, not even just losses, he had 3 knockout losses when he beat Jamel Charlo. He had 3 knockout losses. And that's the guy that you're going to talk about. Now, don't get me wrong, Jamel Charlo did defeat the undefeated Jason Rosario and Erickson Lubin, but I'm sorry, but those guys are just not A-grade fighters. To be quite honest with you, they're really not even B-grade fighters. Okay, they're not even B-grade fighters. So, it is what it is.
Any of those type of names on his resume.
And even the undefeated fighters within that division right now, like Sebastian Fundora and, what the hell is that one Australian kid's name? Tim Tszyu. Those guys are not A-grade fighters. I'm sorry. It is what it is. If Jamel Charlo, in my view, really wants to challenge himself, he's going to face the winner of Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr., or he's going to go up to 160, faces Demetrius Bubble Andrade. Even a Gennady Golovkin at this point in time in his career could potentially beat Jamel Charlo. And Gennady Golovkin is about a shadow of what he formerly was. Well, I'm not going to say a shadow, but he's about probably 50% of what he was.
See, this is the problem with black fighters today. They are terrified of the backlash from the racist fans. They're terrified of race.
What the hell are you talking about, Dante? If Terence Bud Crawford was that terrified of the backlash from the quote-unquote racist fans, and don't get me wrong, there's a certain amount of them out there. Terence Bud Crawford overall would have not said something about Canelo Alvarez and when he was caught on steroids. Or he would have not said all in all that he believes that he's the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. Like, do you believe that Terence Bud Crawford clearly overall designed this list because he's afraid overall of what other people are going to say? Or is this just truly his opinion? One thing I like about Terence Bud Crawford, what at least I'll say about this, and I don't always agree with everything that he says, but one thing I'll say about Terence Bud Crawford is this. He seems to have a very, very high boxing IQ. And he can tell which fighters are elite and which fighters are not elite. Okay? He can tell. That's why even when he was talking about Tyson Fury, I believe not too long ago, he gave Tyson Fury a very high amount of praise because Terence Crawford, and one thing I, overall will give him admiration for is this: he does not appear overall to go on this bullshit of this pro-racial bullshit when it comes down to it. Of Terence Bud Crawford thinks on a higher level than that. He thinks on a logical and objective level, at least somewhat. Somewhat.
People filling up their comment section. I'm talking about their Instagram, their Twitters, etc., etc. Matter of fact, when Canelo Alvarez lost to Dimitri Bivol, even Ellie Setback dissed Terence Crawford because Crawford came out and he said, now we know who pound for pound number one is. Ellie actually made a video in response to Terence Crawford saying this, and he said the comments on the internet of fans disagreeing with Terence Crawford proves that he's not number one. And then Ellie, he said that Canelo Alvarez is still number one, the best fighter in the world. And the only reason it's important to note that Ellie Setback is saying these things because Ellie Setback is a reporter that does exclusive interviews with all of these black boxers, but yet he...
Yes, and I'm not really that big of a supporter of Ellie Sackback either, or Sackback, whatever the hell his name is. He's been a part of boxing media for a very, very long time. I always thought that he was a bit biased in his commentary as well. Could he have a racial issue? I have no idea. But let's stop the bullshit overall of going over all these black fighters. They're terrified, so that's the reason overall why they rank things like this. Dante, shut up. This guy has been going on this narrative for so goddamn long. This is the era to where basically you can say whatever the hell that you want to. And people almost will, at least overall, especially if you're a minority in a sport, and that's not me trying to, say overall that, any negative thing there, but what that is me trying to say is that, black athletes especially, or minority athletes especially in this generation, they're always told to speak up. LeBron James is always told to speak up, when it comes to basketball. Tennis players, Serena Williams is always told to speak up, when she's in tennis. That's why they always talk about gun control. They always talk about politics. They always talk about shit that they really have no 2 cents that they know about. It just is what it is. They're always told to speak up. And we've heard a multitude of black fighters when it comes down to it say that they believe that either ESPN is mistreating them or yada, 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 blah, 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 blah. From Demetrius Andre to Deontay Wilder to Shakur Stevenson to Terence Bud Crawford to a certain amount of other fighters. So the question is that do you truly believe that Terence Bud Crawford is so terrified of these racist fans that that's the reason why he put Naoya Inoue or Oleksandr Usyk on his list? Or is that just his list? Like, come on. And I get what Dante is trying to say, but, his narratives oftentimes can just be so obnoxious. Because this dude half the time is just so full of shit. He sees over one Caucasian or one other fighter, one Latino fighter, or one fighter all in all that's not an American black fighter that he doesn't like on the list, and all of a sudden he just goes wild. Like, maybe this is just Terence Bud Crawford's list. Now, do I 100% agree with the list? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, that's his list. Now don't get me wrong. Do certain lists deserve to be criticized when you can clearly tell that there's a pattern or there's no logic or objectivity whatsoever? Yes, absolutely. But I don't think that it's a horrible list. I think that all those fighters that he mentioned are at least within the top 10 pound per pound, at least certainly debatably. So I don't think that it's really the worst list in the world. But we all know why Dante has a very, very big problem with this list. But anyway.
Roots against all of them when they're fighting against a non-black opponent. And he doesn't hide this because he makes it very clear on the videos that he makes. Listen, when it comes to boxing in general, when it comes to old media, the difference from them.
Listen to all the good stuff. Escape reality. Indulge in the drama.
When they create a pound for pound list, they don't care how biased it looks. They don't care how racist they look.
It's really the same with you. So I don't know why the hell you're talking. Because I've seen pound for pound lists from you that make no goddamn sense whatsoever. And I'm sure when your next pound for pound list releases, it's going to look exactly the goddamn same. So I really have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Or why Boxing Eagle is talking that way, or Aki TV, because your pound for pound lists are absolutely, they're horrible. It just is what it is. Basically, once again, and this is no offense against those channels, the LDBC or New Media, but once again, all these guys are, and all their objective is how many black fighters can we really put on the list? That's really their only objective. All right? That's why they have such a problem with Vasily Lomachenko, Oleksandr Usyk, Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury, yada, 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 yada. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at their comments. I've been saying this for years. It is what it is. That's how they operate because they have a very big emotional and pro-racial issue. They do not operate on the higher level of intelligence. It just is what it is. Because when you're a person all in all that operates on the higher level of intelligence, at least to a certain degree, and you learn to be logical and objective, it shows. And I'm sorry, but Dante and these guys are not logical and are not objective. And ESPN, in my view, is not logical and objective either. But the reason overall for that, and kind of like Dante as well, is that if you're involved in a sports commentary, the majority of people do not have the ability to be super logical and objective because they're sports fans. And what that is going to do is that it's overall going to make you super emotional or super argumentative or, basically super biased, maybe pro-racial bias when it comes down to it in the sport of boxing, especially because there is no other sport that I see personally that has as much of a racial tension in it than that of the fight game. Whether we talk about the UFC, MMA, or, kickboxing, boxing, whatever it may be. But anyway.
Are going to stay on code and stick to their agenda, no matter how you feel about it. It doesn't matter how dominant Black American fighters are in the sport of boxing. It doesn't matter how many Black American boxers become undisputed. Old media is not going to give them the credit they deserve unless everyone comes out. And when I say everyone, I'm talking about all of these Black American boxers and all of the most significant people that are not even Black, that are in the sport.
So basically, what Dante's vaccination just told you, he basically just told you what his goal and what his objective was, which was overall is that we're going to cover Black fighters in a way, overall, to where we make the world overall believe that they are just purely within a top 10 pound per pound class and there's no one else there. That's basically overall what he is trying to tell you. And don't get me wrong, if that's the case, then that's the case. But you're gonna sit here and tell me that Oleksandr Usyk or Canelo or some of those guys do not deserve to be at least within the top 10 pound per pound. Tyson Fury, and Naoya Inoue, if you were a person that maybe were to debate his spot, I get it, because in my view he does not really have a resume whatsoever in terms of beating big name opponents. But there are some fighters out there, all in all, other than that of Black American fighters that do deserve to be within a top 10 pound per pound conversation. Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez, Oleksandr Usyk. Okay, those are fighters that, for example, deserve to be there. Once again, notice that the only fighter that was a Caucasoid fighter or that was a Latino fighter that he ever would try to put on the top 10 pound per pound list in a high ranking was that of Josh Taylor. You know why he did that? Because Josh Taylor, he knew that if Terence Crawford had a fight with him and that if he beat him, he could say, wow, look at that. Terence Crawford defeated a top 5 pound per pound fighter. That's the reason why they ranked Josh Taylor so high. But the fighters that really look to be the king of not even just one weight division, but multiple weight divisions, they always tried to tear down. So Tyson Fury, Oleksandr Usyk, Canelo Alvarez, Vasily Lomachenko, they never liked those fighters from the get-go. And listen, I understand, do you sometimes have to watch out for media because, once again, there can be great big white hypes or, they can try to push these guys when they really shouldn't be as pushed? Yeah, certainly, you can have certain cases of that, but we have to take a look at things logically and objectively. And when we take a look at Oleksandr Usyk, Canelo Alvarez, even Vasily Lomachenko, and, a few other guys out there, Canelo Alvarez, even Naoya Inoue, all those guys you can debate possibly within your top 10 pound per pound list. If not within your top 10 pound per pound, at least some of those guys, they would have to be probably within your top 20. And that's also not me mentioning Dimitri Bivol, who has to be within your top 10 pound per pound list now because he defeated Canelo Alvarez. But anyway.
Boxing, unless all of them come together and expose old media and call them what they are. See, but by way of contrast, when it comes to Black people, when it comes to Black fighters in particular, like Terence Crawford.
And realize that Terence Bud Crawford, that he had 3 Black American fighters on the list. So what is Dante's Boxing Nation really trying to tell you? Once again, it's been what I've been saying for a while. He does not want to see even one Caucasian fighter on the list or one Latino fighter or one Asian fighter on the list. He doesn't want to see any of those guys. And don't get me wrong, very oftentimes Black athletes can be the most dominant in sports, especially in that of American sports. But listen, boxing is a very, very mixed sport. All right, it's very, very mixed. And overall, that more than likely is always going to lead to somewhat of a pound-for-pound mixed list. Okay? So it is what it is. If you were to ask me for my top 10 pound-for-pound list, once again, I've already told people my top 5. I have Terence Crawford, Errol Spence there, Oleksandr Usyk, Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez. Those guys are within my top 5. My bottom 5, I probably would have Devin Haney, Josh Taylor, Shakur Stevenson now at the moment. Those are 3 guys. Maybe I would also have, maybe if I can't think of another one, maybe Jamel Charlo. Oh no, Dimitri Bivol also would have to be there as well. And I probably would have Jamel Charlo now there, probably at number 10. And then right below them, within my top 15, I would probably have to have, both Gervonta Tank Davis and Vasily Lomachenko. I would also have, I'm trying to think who else would be within my top 15 pound for pound. Archer B2B, if I forgot about as well. Archer B2B probably would be within my top 20 to top 15, somewhere around there. And then there might be some other fighters that I'm personally forgetting about at the moment. If I'm forgetting anyone that I believe is super duper dominant, let me know. And if we're talking about fighters below them, I don't know, maybe fighters like a Gennady Golovkin, Oscar Valdez, Steven Fulton. There may be a few other ones that I'm personally forgetting at the moment. Maybe that one dude who seems to be the most dominant at cruiserweight right now. That those guys are pretty much would be within my top 20 pound per pound. But anyway.
He puts his list together, his pound for pound list. He wants to overcompensate because unlike old media, Crawford cares about what people are going to think about his pound for pound list. He knows that if he doesn't put
Crawford doesn't give a shit about what people overall think about him, and he doesn't really give a shit overall about what people think about his pound for pound list. If Terence Crawford really gave that much of a shit about his opinion overall, or if he really feared that people would not like him overall for that, he wouldn't have said the same things that he did about Canelo Alvarez and some other fighters out there, or Vasily Lomachenko. So come on, Dante, you're trying to pull a straw argument out of your ass like you regularly do, but it is what it is anyway.
Inoue or Usyk all the way at the top, above fighters that are more accomplished than them, Terence Crawford, he knows that he's going to be flooded with...
Let me rewind that.
If he doesn't put Inoue or Usyk all the way at the top...
Once again, notice 2 of the fighters that he mentioned. Now, if he just mentioned Naoya Inoue, or Inoue, however you pronounce it, I would agree. But if you're talking about Oleksandr Usyk, no, Oleksandr Usyk has to be within your top 5 pound per pound. He defeated overall a bevet of undefeated, decently talented fighters at the cruiserweight division, including Michael Hunter and Maris Bradis and a couple of other ones that perhaps I'm not thinking of at the moment. He also ended up defeating, when it came down to it, Anthony Joshua, who was at least within your top 20 pound per pound. And on some lists, top 10. So, no, Oleksandr Usyk has to be within your top 5. Let's stop bullshitting. Okay? Let's stop bullshitting. All right? So, it is what it is. But once again, notice that he didn't give a shit that Devin Haney or, Errol Spencer, he was there. He didn't give a shit about that. Trust me, overall, if Jaron Boots Ennis was there, who hasn't even won a belt yet, Dante would not be saying a goddamn thing. So, come on.
Above fighters that are more accomplished than them, Terence Crawford, he knows that he's going to be...
What fighters are more accomplished overall than that of Oleksandr Usyk if we're just having that conversation? Now, if you want to talk about it in terms of resume, compared to Naoya Inoue, that makes sense. Once again, keep in mind, this is the same person that always debated that Terence Bud Crawford is the number 1 pound for pound fighter because he looks to be the most dominant in the world. And he was a 3-weight division champion. So how come that same energy is not there with Naoya Inoue? Very, very interesting. Now, even the opponents that Terence Crawford fought at 140, even though I did not think that they were that great. Victor Postol, you can debate, is a bigger win in Terence Crawford's career, at least when Victor Postol was undefeated, than any of the wins in Naoya Inoue's career, if you want to debate that. Because I'm sorry, I just don't count a very old Nonito Donaire who already had several losses, a few knockout losses in his career, and someone who got dominated by Carl Frampton. I don't count that as a fighter that, in my view, was an A-grade fighter. But it just is what it is. Although he was coming off of a couple of decent wins over undefeated prospects in this last fight. But at the end of the day, like I said, if we're comparing Oleksandr Usyk to some of these fighters, let's compare Oleksandr Usyk overall to Jamel Charlo. Does Jamel Charlo, first of all, is he a multiple weight division champion? No, he's not. So Oleksandr Usyk beats him there. Is he undefeated like Oleksandr Usyk? No, he's not. If you want to debate that. Does he have a win in his career like what Oleksandr Usyk has over Anthony Joshua? No, really not even that close. So at the end of the day, Oleksandr Usyk has to be over him. That's really not even a debate in my view. If we compare him to Devin Haney, even though I think Devin Haney certainly proved his point that he now has to be on the top 10 pound for pound list, I can't put him above him. I can't put Shakur Stevenson above him. I can't put Dimitri Bivol above him at the current moment. Because yes, you beat Canelo Alvarez, but you beat the smaller man, and on top of that, that's the first really legitimate, or at least 100% A-grade win in your career, or at least A-plus win. So I can't put any of those fighters over Oleksandr Usyk. The only fighters, in my view, that can debatably be over Oleksandr Usyk at the current moment in time, once again, would be within my top 5. That would be Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., Tyson Fury, and maybe Canelo, if you maybe still wanted to debate him. But I think Canelo, until he gets back to his winning ways, he's going to have to remain in my number 5 spot. But we'll see what happens.
Flooded with racist comments on his Instagram, Twitter, etc., just like Ellie Setback told him when he was receiving backlash because he said that he was the best fighter in the world. While fighters like Jamel Charlo, Terence...
Well, wait a minute. I thought you said that, Terence Bud Crawford was afraid to get some, overall racist comments from, overall, or, basically get comments overall that he really fears what people have to say about him. So why would he say that about Canelo Alvarez in the first place? Because Terence Bud Crawford's been saying this about Canelo Alvarez for the past couple of years. So you tell me that this is the first time that Terence Bud Crawford has had to deal with racist fans, and all of a sudden he's just going to take it anymore, and now he finally seen the severity of it? Like, get the fuck out of here, man. Listen, Terence Bud Crawford created his list. It's his list. And to be honest with you, I don't disagree with it heavily. There's a couple of spots that I disagree with. But all those fighters I have within my top 10 pound per pound list. So to me, it's not really that big of a deal anyway. Now, if I seen a list on the note to where I seen, if it's something like boxing scene, to where I seen Gennady Golovkin on the top 10 pound per pound list, or Alexander Povetkin or something like that, then maybe I would say something's rotten in Denmark. But, this list seems somewhat at least okay.
Crawford, Errol Spence, Devin Haney, Stephen Fulton are taking on the toughest challenges. Old media is praying that Inoue, he stays away from the toughest challenges. Right now, Inoue, the biggest fight for Inoue, the most competitive fight for him, and the biggest fight, the biggest name that he could fight would be against Stephen Fulton, who is 4 pounds bigger than Inoue. Now, of course, Inoue, he can stay in his own weight class. He doesn't have to move up. But if he stays in his own weight class, he doesn't have the opponents to be on the top 5 of anyone's pound-for-pound list.
I agree with you there. I actually think that that's a very, very decent point. But Dante, you better keep that same energy. Because once upon a time, you had Deontay Wilder on your top 5 pound per pound list. And Deontay, there's no offense against Deontay, and I have a great amount of respect for every fighter. But Deontay's career really was a career of pretty much knocking out C-grade fighters before he got to Luis Ortiz and Tyson Fury. But anyway.
Crazy, because as dominant as black fighters are in the sport of boxing, it's like their kryptonite is racist fans. The only time you see any type of intimidation from these black fighters is when they are worried about what the racist fans will say. Perfect example. Terence Crawford, he had went on to the DAZN show a while before Canelo Alvarez lost. And Terence Crawford, he actually spoke some truth. He said Canelo Alvarez is avoiding the undefeated black boxers. And
Yes, Terence Bud Crawford did say that. And he's been saying that for the past couple of years. So you're telling me that Terence Crawford, for these past couple of years, that, he finally gave in to the criticism, I don't want I don't want other demographics offended. Terence Crawford don't give a shit. Terence Crawford Terence Crawford said what he said because he believed what he said. All right. Now, do I believe with him that Canelo Alvarez is completely avoiding some of those undefeated black fighters? No. But at the end of the day, Terence Crawford, has the feeling to his opinion. And at the end of the day, once again, overall, he put this top 5 pound per pound list out there. And Dante's Boxing Nation is butthurt because basically Terence Crawford, who is a black American fighter, put out this top 5 pound per pound list. And now this is a setback for some of his videos and his opinions. because now he's like shit, Terence. But Crawford even overall said that Oleksandr Usyk is up there, Naoya Inoue is up there. Now, in my view, Naoya Inoue does not deserve to be up there. But Oleksandr Usyk, yes, certainly. And another fighter that deserves to be up there as well is Tyson Fury. And Canelo I would have in my number 5 spot right now.
Crawford, he received so many comments from racist Canelo Alvarez fans that about a month or two later, after Terence Crawford had said that about Canelo Alvarez, he then said Canelo Alvarez is the best fighter in the world above him. And now that old media is scrambling to find someone else to replace Canelo Alvarez and say that Inoue is either number 1.
So you think all in all that, or Terence Crawford apparently said that Canelo Alvarez overall is the best fighter in the world above him? I would have to see that. Maybe Terence Crawford said that Canelo is the best fighter below him, or maybe he said something like Canelo is one of the best fighters in the world, but I would have to see that.
Or number 2. Now Terence Crawford is following that narrative, and he's saying that he's number 2 above Jermell Charlo, Errol Spence, and everyone else. At the end of the day, what gives old media so much power is the fact that a lot of these black fighters of significance, they will usually repeat old media's talking points as long as it doesn't pertain to them. Devin Haney was pretty much reciting everything that old media was saying when it came to Canelo Alvarez. He was saying that he was pound for pound the best fighter in the world, which means he's better than Crawford, which means...
Yes, and Devin Haney, all in all, was not the only black fighter that stated. He also was not the only black person overall in sports media that stated that he believed that Canelo Alvarez was the number 1 pound for pound. Devin Haney said that. Gervonta Tank Davis said that. I believe Shakur Stevenson at one point in time said that. Both Charlo brothers ended up stating that. Stephen A. Smith ended up stating that. Timothy Bradley, I believe, ended up stating that. So, do all these guys just fear the racist comments that flood in? Or do sometimes they have an opinion of their own? Like, come on, man. It just is what it is.
He's better than all the...
And don't get me wrong, is there such a thing as maybe black men or, black fighters or black athletes, under, succumbing to the pressure? Yeah, sure. But, sometimes when someone says something, it doesn't always mean that they're just succumbing to the pressure. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of that one situation when O.J. Simpson, way back in the day, or Tiger Woods, and certain, so many people got in such an uproar about this when Tiger Woods overall said that he was not black, that he was mixed. Or when O.J. said that he did not define himself as a black man, he defined himself basically by his individuality, or that he's O.J. Simpson. Which I didn't think overall was really that big of a problem. This reminds me of that same shit. That's why I really can't respect someone like Dante, because he just, no offense against Dante, no offense against him at all. I think some of what he does, I think that he has the right idea. I just think that he goes about it the wrong way. But he just sings like such a bitch. It just is what it is. He's such an over-emotional, pro-racial bitch. It just is what it is. No offense, but it's just the truth.
He's been avoiding. But when these same people that Devin Haney was agreeing with came out with their pound-for-pound list after Devin became undisputed, and they had Lomachenko ranked higher than Devin Haney, that's when Devin Haney said, hey, this doesn't make sense. This is a clear-cut double standard right here. Now you have Terence Crawford saying that he's pound for pound the best fighter in the world, but once again, Inoue is above everyone else on the list. You had Errol Spence that was constantly saying Canelo Alvarez is pound for pound the best fighter in the world.
That's right, he did. I guess Errol Spence Jr. must be afraid of the racists too. Come on, man. It just, what, you tell me that these several black fighters, that they're just all afraid of the pressure? Don't get me wrong. Are there black athletes sometimes that are maybe afraid of that, or try to conform? Yeah, sure. But do I believe that that is the situation here? No, I don't. But Dante's been trying to say this shit for years. That's his way of trying to tear down someone like a Canelo or Usyk or someone like that. And I told people, I basically told people this a year ago, that you're going to hear a lot more, insults on Oleksandr Usyk and Tyson Fury and all these other guys, overall who are not black American fighters from these LDBC and new media channels, because they are now looked at as some of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters on the planet.
When instead, he could have said that he was the best fighter in the world and Terence Crawford was number 2. You see, guys, once again, if all of these black fighters were to get on the same page just like old media does when they all start saying that Inoue is the best, Canelo is the best. Old media, they can tell you anyone is the best. And black fighters will start saying the very next day, that's the best fighter in the world right there. You know,
I understand your point, Dante, but let me put it this way. How many black fighters stated that Teofimo Lopez was the actual undisputed king of 135 pounds? There wasn't that many of them. How many of them stated that Vasily Lomachenko was the actual undisputed 135-pound champion? I don't remember any of them. How many of them stated all in all that, that Brian Castano all in all that he was that he was going to beat Jamel Charlo? Like, you know what I'm saying here? Like I said, some of the things that Terence Crawford is saying, or some of the things that some of these black fighters were saying, they overall sometimes have, some truth to it. It just is what it is. Not every black fighter that says something, or black person in media that says something, not every single one of them are just succumbing to the pressure. Sometimes that's just their list.
why? Because once one person from old media says it, all of them get on code.
And you have to wonder why people like Shakur Stevenson and Terence Bud Crawford, two people that within the past year have alleged that ESPN is super duper racial bias, that if they were truly, if they truly overall were succumbing to the pressure, why the hell overall would they state certain things like that about ESPN? Like, come on, man. I mean, I don't know. Maybe one could possibly allege it that maybe all in all they don't want to think that they're racist, but I personally don't think that Shakur Stevenson and Terence Bud Crawford really give a fuck what people think. Which is a good thing, as long as overall you're not being too, harsh or careless, with whatever you put out there.
They don't have to call each other and say, okay, guys, so this is the new narrative, this is the new agenda, we're going to say this. They don't have to say that because all of them already know what time it is. As soon as one person says that Inoue is the best now, Canelo is the best now, Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez is the best now. Once that one person says it, it spreads like wildfire, even when it's the furthest thing from the truth. As long as these
Well, I agree that Naoya Inoue being within the top 5 pound per pound is a stretch. But when Vasily Lomachenko and Canelo Alvarez were rated as the number 1 pound per pound, I really didn't have that big of a problem with it because, to be honest with you, I thought that they deserved to be ranked there. But Dante can't have that. And that's basically the main objective of his channel, which I've been stating for a very, very long time. And I get these fanboys that come on my channel and say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. He's just overall speaking the truth. And no, what Dante is doing is that he's trying to speak his truth, or overall he's trying to put that narrative out there. Because Dante does not think like a logical and objective person. It just is what it is.
Are only thinking about themselves when they see the double standards, when they see that they're not getting the credit they deserve, the more easier it will be for old media to discredit these fighters. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. Let me tell you guys about
But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that would be a very interesting video. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see where Mr. Terence Bud Crawford goes from here. And I hope that Terence Bud Crawford, at least for his sake, that he does get that Errol Spence Jr. fight, whether he wins that fight or not. May the best man win, because I do believe that that is a great, great fight. One of the greatest fights probably of all time. Because I believe that both of those fighters are both A-plus fighters. But, hopefully Terence Bud Crawford, he gets that fight. And hopefully both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Bud Crawford, they get finally at least the debate of possibly being the number 1 undisputed pound-per-pound fighter. Because it doesn't really matter what Dante's list is going to be or what ESPN's list is going to be, Fox News' list is going to be. It doesn't really matter to them. I'm a person that's decently logical and objective. I'll probably come out with my own list, and I always try to rank things logically and objectively. But whether you agree with my rankings or not, if Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., if they're able to remain undefeated and whoever wins that fight, who the hell knows, because there's so many goddamn draws these days, especially in the first fight or something. But at the end of the day, whoever the winner of that fight more than likely is now going to be the undisputed number 1 pound-per-pound fighter, especially now that Canelo Alvarez has lost his last fight. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.